In the summer of 2014, the world was in a festive mood as yet another World Cup was about to head underway. But on Wednesday, June 11th, the city of Sao Paulo, one of the main hosts of the World Cup, was anything but festive. Entire parts of the city remained shut, as cars were stuck on stretches of tarmac as far as the eye could see. The effects soon extended well beyond the city, as the entire country of Brazil felt the effects of what would become the worst traffic jam in history. Eventually, the jam was said to have been over 214 miles long. Disputes about the economic implications of hosting a World Cup, worker deaths, and countrywide protests were ultimately what led to it. But Sao Paulo is notorious for being one of the most congested places in the entire planet. Now, you and I may not have been in such a historic traffic jam, but we've definitely had our experiences of being stuck in traffic. When the cars barely seem to move, the lights barely seem to change, and before you know it, a little 5-mile drive ended up taking you over 2 hours. Aside from driving us completely out of our minds, these traffic jams have obvious implications, economic and otherwise. Just in 2018 alone, traffic congestion is said to have cost the US economy around $87 billion. In addition, congestion increases fuel consumption, and by extension, emissions. In reality, this just hurts us more than it helps. It wastes precious time that we could have spent just being where we wanted to be. Instances of road rage rise, which then contributes to more driver error, which means more accidents, which means more traffic. It sucks. Traffic is much more demanding on our body, mind, and deteriorates the quality of life of everyone involved. You either go to the office to angry bosses or home to a cold dinner. Which really begs the question, how far off are we to solving this terrible, terrible thing? Well, let's get to that. What makes traffic jams and congestion so interesting is that, beyond the more quantifiable metrics such as the flow of cars, the volume of traffic, number of lanes, and so on, there's this other spontaneous factor to this phenomenon that's much more harder to predict or measure. The human factor. Each vehicle is, after all, being maneuvered or piloted by a human driver, at least for now anyway. And as such, the intricacies of traffic are, in a way, just expressions of the intricacies of human behavior. It all defaults back to us, the driver. It's no wonder then that Tom Vanderbilt, a guy who literally wrote an entire book talking about traffic, calls New York City traffic a giant applied psych lab. Let's see why he would say that. He refers to an experiment conducted in England by a traffic psychologist named Ian Walker, where bicycles are rigged with sensors that would calculate the distance and speed of vehicles driving past. The experimental conditions were as such. In the first scenario, the rider was wearing a helmet. In the second, he wasn't. And in the third, he tried to appear female by wearing a wig and a dress. It was found that, when the rider appeared to be wearing a helmet, the cars felt more comfortable driving close by. When he wasn't wearing a helmet, they gave him a bit more space. And when the rider seemed to be a woman, they gave him even more space. These are judgments, which Tom likes to call beneath the subconscious, that the drivers were making about the competence of the rider, and the likelihood of an accident with very little and often inaccurate evidence. Ask yourself, are riders wearing helmets always more experienced? Does wearing a helmet make you safer? Physically, yes, but mentally, it could cause you to act differently, and take risky maneuvers that you otherwise might not have. There are other experiments like this, of course. You might think that the more regulated a traffic is, the safer it is. The more often you see signals and signs at intersections, the more careful they will be. But that's not the case as it turns out. If there's too many signals, drivers often find themselves in a false sense of security. The seemingly abundance of caution that the traffic lights can portray causes drivers to drop their guard in the most risky parts of the road, which often leads to more accidents. This seemingly unintuitive idea was actually discovered due to an electrical failure in a traffic light. And the observation, and the later theory that emerged from it, is credited to Dutch traffic engineer Hans Moderman. He developed the idea of shared space when driving. Essentially, instead of adding more signs, street markings, crosswalks, and so on, you instead actually remove these things, the very things you think were actually making you safe. There are no curbs separating the street from the sidewalk. There aren't sidewalks to begin with, it's just all together, cars and pedestrians. With this, drivers find themselves less confident than they were before, because, well, there's no separation. There's nothing splitting those driving cars and those who are just on bikes or even walking. It makes drivers more cautious, which in turn actually saves more lives by preventing accidents in traffic as opposed to increasing it. Of course, there are more intuitive instances of traffic behavior, namely things like rubbernecking. It's when an accident in one lane of traffic causes drivers in other lanes, or even other roads, to slow down while they're passing by to watch things as they unfold, because we're nosy and like to get into other people's business. But beyond the physical obstruction that the accident causes, this is an added slowdown often caused purely by psychological reasons. If just a few cars slow down from this, other cars behind them are forced to slow down. The ripple effect leads to more widespread congestion, and before you know it, you're in bumper-to-bumper traffic. That's exactly why in some countries, accident sites are quickly covered with portable boundaries to prevent people from catching an unnecessary glance. But here again, the human factor creeps in. Tom suggests that there might be more to this mundane activity. He thinks that drivers sometimes pause not to just see what's going on, but also to reflect briefly on their own morality, the possibility of something like this happening to them as well. Everyone thinks they're a good driver, until they aren't. Another curious aspect of traffic is the non-linearity between the amount of traffic and the congestion that it leads to. What I mean is, if only 1% of all drivers were to use public transportation, that could lead to a reduction in traffic by more than 20%. Although not a bottleneck in the traditional sense, the convention of 9 to 5 office hours might have a lot to do with congestion as well. In normal circumstances, in daily routine, traffic tends to form at similar times because everyone is on similar schedules. Everyone heading to work at roughly the same time has been notoriously bad for economies. With the recent pandemic and the wave of companies trying to get their work done online, you have to wonder what the long-term implications of this newfound flexibility will be on traffic. While most offices will still be operated from physical spaces, even a slight reduction in the daily number of commuters could have a drastic effect on congestion and improve economies while doing so. And while the long-term changes might be positive for the most part, it doesn't mean everything is perfect. Some studies have emerged stating that, while there were indeed fewer accidents by volume, a higher percentage of them were fatal. Drivers were again guilty of feeling safer, and were thereby less alert, on emptier roads, which led to more speeding. The psychological implications of feeling safe on the road can cause a chain reaction of decisions that ultimately make you less safe, which is another remarkable stat that doesn't make sense on first glance. Sometimes, the bottlenecks are even more obvious. For example, roads that are not wide enough to accommodate necessary volumes, unplanned infrastructure, or as in the case of Sao Paulo, a massive countrywide protest. These are some of the biggest causes of congestion on our roads today. If we were somehow able to control these issues, however, would that mean the eradication of traffic forever? Well, if only things were that simple. In one of the more remarkable experiments by some Japanese physicists, you can see cars traveling in a circle, completely devoid of any of the traditional bottlenecks. All they have to do is turn left. That's literally it. They are driving in a closed circular track, no intersections, no distractions. They are also asked to maintain a steady speed and a steady distance, traditional traffic advice. So it's not like the experiment is rigged to cause the drivers to make a mistake. In fact, they're just asking them to drive normally. And sure enough, they start just fine. But after the experiment runs for a brief period, as time passes on, the human factor steps in. Some of the drivers have difficulty maintaining a steady speed or distance. They are either too close to the vehicle in front or the one behind. To correct this, they have to brake or accelerate. As with most human drivers, they end up overcompensating. After all, better safe than sorry, right? Now, this causes the driver behind this car to stop as well, and the results of all these reactions are further compounded by the reaction times of each of the other drivers. A sudden braking in front of a driver causes him to brake, and that causes the driver behind him to brake as well. Erratic braking emerges out of nowhere, and with it emerges a congested flow of traffic. Before you know it, you're stuck in traffic where there shouldn't be. Traffic that came out of nowhere. This is what is called a phantom traffic jam. Out of nothing physical whatsoever, a traffic jam self-generates using only our reaction times, and often, it dissipates as organically as it emerges. Besides, you have to consider the fact that if even the most controlled simulations can lead to such a traffic jam, then the chaos of the real world only adds fuel to the fire. Real roads are not single-lane, closed-off circular tracks. They are mazes of tarmac, driven on by drivers that are using their phones, drivers that are in a hurry, drivers that are barely rested, drivers that probably shouldn't be driving. Theoretically, the ripple effect of traffic jams could still be absorbed by maintaining a long enough gap between vehicles. The more space you have between you and the car ahead of you, the more time you and the cars behind you have to react in time to brake smoothly and still keep going. It can be difficult to accept that the phantom traffic jams seemingly arise out of nothing, especially given the overall impact of traffic jams on the economy, our well-being, and the rest of the world. Which brings us to traffic forecasting. If you aren't able to prevent traffic, maybe being aware of when it may occur is the next best thing? Right now, most of us use Google Maps to estimate traffic in a particular region. If you've ever used your phone as a GPS, you'll see areas that show up red as congested areas begin to form. Google uses Android phones to crowdsource data about numerous things like the number of vehicles in a region and how fast they're moving. And if you've ever used an Android phone yourself, you've contributed to the pool of data too. But it's still not necessarily forecasting a jam. It's merely telling you if one has already been formed, which is certainly useful, but not a solution. Newer methods of forecasting are being developed with the use of machine learning and AI. Cameras mounted on signals and busy intersections are feeding data to a control center that is then regulating traffic signals across a given region. This is allowing for two things. 1. To be able to predict traffic with as much as 90% accuracy. And 2. To be able to react to emerging congestions by temporarily closing off certain roads and opening others. It's being tested in one of the most congested regions in the world, India. But the tests are still on a smaller scale. These systems are yet to see large-scale implementation. But there is a possibility that these forecasting systems will become obsolete before they're even rolled out. That's because of the emergence of self-driving cars. Think about it. What is at the core of some of the most unavoidable traffic jams? The human factor. It is the inability of human drivers to maintain a steady speed and distance, and self-driving cars can take that element right out of the equation. Aside from being able to better prevent fatal accidents, I think another major aspect of how self-driving cars will change our roads for the better is by preventing congestion. If cars can communicate amongst themselves, lanes could be merged automatically. Blind spots would no longer be a thing if you have 360-degree cameras on the car. We could even get rid of signals and traffic lights since the cars would just communicate amongst themselves about when to stop and when to go. That would reduce a lot of the clutter in our cityscapes. But what about the cars that are still driven by us humans? The thing is, the transition to 100% self-driving cars could be an extremely difficult one if we're not careful. We still have to factor in that in the near future, the roads will not be the automated utopia that we're dreaming of. Rather, they'll be a bit of both, human-driven cars and self-driven cars, each adapting to one another. If we're so busy building our infrastructure with driverless cars, we could forget about the very people that are supposed to be benefiting from it. After all, a self-driving car's job will not only be to drive itself and communicate with other self-driving cars, but to also adapt to the unpredictability of a human driver, however many of them are still remaining. Transportation has always been tied to civilization. Our ability to cooperate in large numbers, which is what led to the rise and sustenance of our civilization, has a lot to do with the ability to cover large distances sustainably. A large portion of that distance has been covered on roads. In fact, getting from A to B has a remarkable effect on our perception of the world and the decisions we take. Aside from the obvious economic implications traffic has, it also makes the world seem like a larger place than it needs to be. People spend a disproportionate amount of valuable time out on the roads, time that you'll never get back. They also don't meet each other as often, and a lot of the world's wonders that surround us remain untouched, unexplored. Making sure that we explore them involves understanding traffic jams, and by extension, the minds of the humans that cause them.